Lecture 19, Chronic Diseases Sora continued. In the work on chronic diseases, Hahnemann refers to Sora as the oldest, most universal and most pernicious chronic miasmatic disease, yet it has been misappropriated more than any other. Sora is the oldest miasmatic chronic disease known. The oldest history of the oldest nation does not reach its origin. Sora is just as tedious as syphilis and psychosis, and is, moreover, hydra-headed. Unless it is thoroughly cured, it lasts until the last breath of the longest life. Not even the most robust constitution, by its own unaided efforts, is able to annihilate and extinguish Sora. The three chronic miasms, Sora, syphilis and psychosis, are all contagious. In each instance, there is something prior to the manifestations which we call disease. We speak of the signs and symptoms of a disease, we speak of the outcroppings of the symptoms when we speak of syphilis, but remember there is a state prior to syphilis or syphilis would not exist. It could not come upon man except for a condition suitable to its development. In like manner Sora could not exist except for a condition in mankind suitable for its development. Sora being the first and the other two coming later, it is proper for us to inquire into that state of the human race that would be suitable for the development of Sora. There must have been a state of the human race suitable to the development of Sora. It could not have come upon a perfectly healthy race, and it would not exist in a perfectly healthy race. There must have been some sickness prior to this state, which we recognize as the chronic miasm Sora, some state of disorder, some state that it would be perfectly rational and proper for man to undertake to solve as to its cause, as to its history, and as to its very nature. Some will say, but if we undertake to do this we will have to accept the Word of God as historical, as relating to the beginning, because there is no other going so far back. There is no harm in reasoning from that, and I hope you will so accept it, not only as history, but as divine revelation, not that I wish to quote from or refer to it, because I never do so in my teaching. If we look upon syphilis we will see that man's own act leads him to the place where he comes in contact with syphilis, it is the result of action. Syphilis is that disease which corresponds to the effect of impure coition, of going where syphilis is, of coming in contact with those who have it. It is an action, it is not so with Sora. Man does not seek it, he does not go where it is, he does not associate with those necessarily that have it. He may be exposed, but syphilis is the result of his own action, which is an impure fornication or adulteration which he knows better than to seek, and knows enough from his intelligence to avoid. Syphilis, then, is a result of action, although after once ultimated it may be perpetuated by accident. There is always a state and condition of man that precedes his action, and if syphilis corresponds to man's action, and there is a state prior to it, a diseased condition that precedes, that state must correspond to that which precedes action, which is thinking and willing. Thinking and willing establishes a state in man that identifies the condition he is in. As long as man continued to think that which was true and held that which was good to the neighbor, that which was uprightness and justice, so long man remained upon the earth free from the susceptibility to disease, because that was the state in which he was created. So long as he remained in that state and preserved his integrity he was not susceptible to disease and he gave forth no aura that could cause contagion, but when man began to will the things that were the outcome of his false thinking then he entered a state which was the perfect correspondence of his interior. As are the will and understanding, so will be the external of man. As the life of man or as the will of man, so is the body of man, and as the two make one in this world, there is evolved from him an aura which is vicious in proportion to his departure from virtue and justice into evils. And long before the time of Noah's flood, which was an inundation that destroyed the evil ones that were upon the earth at that time, there was a manifestation, called leprosy, which was but the result of the dreadful profanity that took place in this period. A great many people suffered then from the violent aura of leprosy, whereas the natural disorder of the human race today is a milder form of Sora upon a different race of people. If we had the same race upon the earth today we would have leprosy among them, as we now have the milder form of Sora. The ancients referred to leprosy as an internal itch. Hence this state, the state of the human mind and the state of the human body, is a state of susceptibility to disease from willing evils, from thinking that which is false and making life one continuous heredity of false things, and so this form of disease, Sora, is but an outward manifestation of that which is prior in man. It was not due to actions of the body, as we find syphilis and psychosis to be, but due to an influx from a state, which progressed and established itself upon the earth, until we can see it as but the outward manifestations of man's very nature. The human race today walking the face of the earth is but little better than a moral leper. Such is the state of the human mind at the present day. To put it another way, everyone is soric. We know what leprosy means, and to say that the whole world is in a state of sora is no broader or narrower than to say that leprosy prevails today upon the face of the earth, but it prevails in a milder form, in the form of sora. A new contagion comes with every child. As sora piles up, generation after generation, century after century, the susceptibility to it increases. This is true of every miasm and true of all drugs. We find in the drugged world that those who have been mercurized become more susceptible to mercury and are more easily poisoned by it. Those poisoned with rus are so sensitive to it that they cannot go within a whiff of it. Those that have been poisoned in their earliest beginning with sora become more sensitive to it, so that in childhood the slightest whiff of it from their school friends will bring on a crop of vesicles between the fingers attended with the acarus. Of course, some persons will say that the acarus is prior to the eruption, but they don't know that a healthy person will not be affected by the acarus. The miasm is simply evolved out of a state, and the acarus is in turn its ultimate. It is the state that is prior, the itch bug is not prior. The human race becomes increasingly sensitive generation after generation to this internal state, and this internal state is the underlying cause which predisposes man to syphilis. If he had not sora, he could not take syphilis. There would be no ground in his economy upon which it would thrive and develop. The will and the understanding are prior to man's action. This is fundamental. The man does not do until he wills what he carries out. If man did what he did not will, he would be only an automaton. He wills to go to a house of prostitution, or seeks for a prostitute with whom to copulate, and from her he takes the syphilitic miasm. This action of his will and this disease corresponds to the man. There is a state in which he thinks it only, in which he wills, but in which he has not yet arrived at the state in which he can act. First there was the thinking of falses and willing of evils, thinking such falses as led to depraved living and long for what was not one's own, until finally action prevailed. The miasms which succeeded sora were but the outward representations of actions, which have grown out of thinking and willing. Sora is the oldest outward expression of the diseases of the human race, representing this vital beginning, and next exists that state that corresponds to action. Thinking, willing and acting are the three things that make up the science of the life of the human race. Man thinks, he wills, and he acts. Now, that aura which is given out from the human race at any period of its history is that which corresponds to the state of the human race. The children inherit it from their parents and carry it on and continue it. As the internal is, so is the external, and the external cannot be except as the result of the internal. The internal state of man is prior to that which surrounds him, therefore, environment is not cause, it is only, as it were, a sounding board, it only reacts upon and reflects the internal. One who has the prior, which is internal, may have that which can follow upon the external. It flows, as it were, from the internal and affects its forms upon the skin, upon the organs, upon the body of man. Such is influx, and the inflowing is always in the direction of the least or no resistance, so that it is in the direction of man's affections, man's loves. Things flow in the direction he wants them to flow. Diseases correspond to man's affections, and the diseases that are upon the human race today are but the outward expression of man's interiors, and it is true if the diseases are such they represent the internal forces of man. Man hates his neighbor, he is willing to violate every commandment, such is the state of man today. This state is represented in man's diseases. All diseases upon the earth, acute and chronic, are representations of man's internals. Otherwise he could not be susceptible, or could not develop that which is within him. The image of his own interior self comes out in disease. This state has continued to progress, and it has accumulated and become complex. The original simple sora has added to its syphilis and psychosis, and these progress and have now effected a state, they have continued to effect a state in mankind, whereby the race is so susceptible to acute affections that many of our citizens have every little thing that comes along, and every little epidemic of influenza brings them down with an acute attack. This could not be but for the complications that a man has caused himself to get into, or has taken upon himself. This was not done in one generation, but has been accumulating upon the face of the earth so long as we have a history of man. Otherwise man would not be sick, for he should be a perfect animal in his animal nature. Look at the perfection of all things put upon the earth, see the plants, how perfect they are, but man by his thinking evils and willing falses has entered upon a state wherein he has lost his freedom, his internal order, and is undergoing changes which the animal kingdom in its period, and the vegetable kingdom in its period, did not take on. The miasms that are at the present day upon the human race are complicated 1,000-fold by allopathic treatment. Every external manifestation of the miasm has in itself a tendency to straighten mankind, but the human race is being violently damaged and diseases are being complicated for the reason that these outward expressions are forced to disappear by the application of some violent or stimulating drug. At the present day nobody will acknowledge that he had the itch in his childhood, until it is seen by some intelligent mother that it is wise to tell the doctor everything. The itch is looked upon as a disgraceful affair, so is everything that has a similar correspondence, because the itch in itself has a correspondence with adultery, only one is adultery as to internals and the other to externals, one succeeds the other. So it is with all miasms. And now we have the great miasms before us to treat, as physicians, in all their complications. For instance, if a true psychotic gonorrhea appears to us second-hand, it appears in its suppressed form, which is 1,000 times worse than the original form. All the outward manifestations have been made to disappear. So it is with the external forms of psora, the vesicular and squamous eruptions, and all the outgrowths and outcroppings of psora. Every conceivable thing has been resorted to destroy its manifestations, and the disease has grown and grown until nobody can tell what its outcome will be. How long can this thing go on before the human race will be swept from the earth with the results of the suppression of psora? From the suppression of psora we have cancerous affections, organic diseases of the heart and lungs, phthisis, and general destruction of the body. How long can it go on? If homeopathy does not spread, if it does not establish its doctrines upon the earth so that sick folks can be headed under its principles, this threatening state and condition will increase. Allopathic physicians are multiplying rapidly, and they are all doing the same thing, even more so now than at the time of Hahnemann. It does seem as if homeopathy had become a necessity, but the kind of homeopathy that is preached in the majority of our schools will not check the progress of psora. The majority of the college teachers sneer at the doctrine of psora, they sneer at the miasms and continue in their efforts to establish homeopathy upon an allopathic basis. Homeopathy as taught in the colleges at the present day is simply an attempt to establish homeopathy upon an allopathic basis, using allopathic names, calling chronic affections by different names, and treating diseases of organs by name. No study is made of psora, but allopathic books are their textbooks. Syphilis is not treated from cause to effect, but simply in the way of driving it back or holding it in abeyance, without any effort to permanently cure it. The patient is filled with mercury, the iodides and other strong drugs, drugs that are well known to subdue it temporarily by an allopathic effect. Psora has progressed until it has become the most contagious of diseases, because the more complicated it becomes the more susceptible are our children to its beginnings, and its contagion adds to the old disease, and while it goes on the children become increasingly sensitive to the other miasms. The human race at the present day is intensely susceptible to psora, to syphilis and psychosis. Psora, says Hahnemann, became, therefore, the common mother of man's chronic diseases. It can be said that at least 7/8 of the chronic maladies existing at the present day are due to psora. True, if psora could be brought back in a series to its simple state, the external of the body would become wonderfully had to look upon, but the internal would be in a much better state. The vesicular eruptions that come are sometimes dreadful to look upon, horrible in proportion to the vanity of the patient, but these must be allowed to evolve themselves, and then wonderful good comes to the economy. Hereditary states roll out in these manifestations, internal evils flow into external manifestations, and homeopathy continues to drive them outward and outward, thereby leaving the economy in a state of comparative freedom. Very commonly itch will not yield to the homeopathic treatment immediately, because the action of the remedy is routing the heredity within, causing it to flow out more exteriorly into manifestations without. One who does not know this, of course, loses heart when his remedies do not at once wipe out the eruption. A sickly child may come out with eruptions, and if the child is treated properly, the sickness will flow out into the eruption and that child will be cured from within out, and finally, after much tribulation, the outward trouble will pass away, carrying with it the internal trouble. So that when it is said that the appropriate remedy did not immediately wipe off the skin and make it smooth, and, therefore, zinc ointment or sulfur ointment was resorted to, we see that it is a violation of law, and a wonderful damage to the patient. Then Hahnemann gives a long list of cases with authorities, quotations and references which you should certainly look over. He also gives the symptoms that he collected while observing and investigating. It was the wonderful similarity between those symptoms when grouped together, representing an image of psora, and those symptoms representing an image of sulfur, which led Hahnemann to the use of sulfur in psoric conditions. In psora we have the images of many remedies. All of the deep-acting remedies have more or less something of the nature of psora.